Hello, and welcome again to Ethics and Leadership. Look at me, all dressed up. I've gone so quickly from my medieval period to my modern period. Well, at least kind of. We're almost there. We've come out of the Renaissance now, and we're making our way into the Enlightenment, and maybe even getting to the beginning of bourgeois man, but I'll have to say more on that later because you probably don't know what bourgeois means, or certainly not how to spell it. It's French. I'm not the... I don't have anything against the French, but man, how they spell words. Okay, so over to my side here, I have King Charles II. What's up? Am I going to interview him? He's dead. This is just a picture. That's absurd. Interview him. Okay. In any case, I have King Charles II here for multiple reasons. One is just because at his coronation, he looked pretty badass. I mean, I'm not a fan of the bloomers and all, but the red robes and the hat, it's all pretty cool. This, in some ways, represents the end that Hobbes is aiming at in absolute monarchy. But Charles II is also important for other reasons. You see, Thomas Hobbes was working on his book, The Leviathan, during the English Civil War, which is a war where Charles I, that'd be his father, was fighting against a group of Republicans under a guy named Cromwell. And so the Republicans wanted to throw out the monarchy and take over and establish more of a public rule, or maybe more of a mixed democracy and aristocracy. Certainly, actually, Cromwell ended up putting himself up as a kind of dictator, but that wasn't the goal of the process. Now, when the war happened, a lot of people who were in the nobility, who were associated with the king, moved out of England and into France. And amongst those was Thomas Hobbes. Now, Hobbes was himself kind of a polymath. He was a Renaissance man in many ways, although at the beginning of the Enlightenment. He had practiced in science, in mathematics, had been a tutor, similar to Aristotle. He knew his classics and had translated works from the Latin. He actually got to meet Galileo and René Descartes, and he was a secretary for Francis Bacon, who's one of the founders of modern scientific method. So the guy got around. He also lived for like 91 years, which is forever at this time. I mean, 91 years, that's crazy. But it was during this period in France that he produced his most famous work and cemented his name into the history of philosophy with the book The Leviathan. It made him famous mostly because everybody hated it. There wasn't anybody who liked it like at all. The people that liked the king didn't like it. The people who were Republicans didn't like it. That wasn't entirely Hobbes's goal, but he did achieve it. His goal was actually to make an argument against those Republicans who were seeking to overthrow the monarchy in England. You see, as Hobbes saw it, the schools in England, you think Oxford, actually he went to Oxford when he was like 14, of course. I mean, I could have done it at 14, but he did. He went to Oxford at 14, and he was familiar with the schools there, and he knew that they taught Aristotle. He also knew that a lot of the advocates of republican government had picked up on Aristotle and used Aristotle's picture of the mixed government as an argument for the withdrawal of the monarchy and a new republican government in England. Hobbes believed that this was horribly misguided. He looked at all the evils of war, all the chaos that had been brought about in England, and he looked at this and he said, something's gone wrong, and he identified the problem with Aristotle. So he decided that really everything in political thought needed to be reconceived. You needed to start over again. Well, that's not entirely true. Actually, he found Machiavelli really interesting, and in some ways, what Hobbes did was to systematize and develop Machiavelli into a whole theory of ongoing government, avoiding the problem of emergency that I mentioned at the end of my lecture on Machiavelli. But in other ways, he even goes quite a different direction from Machiavelli. So, here we have something entirely different. Let's get into the political philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. Oh, by the way, that's Thomas. I mean, I don't know how old he is there, probably like 65. He was 65 when he wrote the Leviathan. Like, that gives me hope. There's still time for me. If I live, as long, 91, in any case. All right, so where to start? Well, one thing that we know about Hobbes is that he was familiar with the developing science in the Enlightenment period. So, as I said, he was a secretary at one period to Francis Bacon. He was familiar with Newton and Newton's new theories that were coming out. And in part, we can understand Hobbes' approach to politics through the lens of this new science that was being developed. The new science that was coming with the Enlightenment was atomist. And by that, I don't mean that it focused on, like, the first created man, Adam. I mean atoms, like the small, teeny, little things. At the time, and even before that, the word atom just meant the smallest indivisible particle. So, if you could break things down into the smallest little bits that were indivisible, the thought was you could then understand the whole. So, for instance, we still work with these kind of ideas. If you can break down a substance into its parts, if you can understand its chemical composition, then maybe you understand its true essence. Maybe you understand what the substance really is, right? So if two people think that they have glasses of water, we could actually check by breaking it down and seeing if they both actually have H2O, hydrogen to oxygens. I think that's hydrogen to oxygen. Yeah, that's right. So the idea was that you could take whatever complex thing you were working with and you could break it down into its individual components. Well, Hobbes thought maybe we could apply this to politics. At least that's part of what gets him started. So he decides to start politics someplace radically different from where Aristotle did. As a matter of fact, entirely different. He says, let's start with the state of nature. Now, don't confuse the state of nature with natural law or with the kind of normative nature that Aristotle imagined. The state of nature is a kind of thought experiment, although Hobbes every once in a while does refer to places that he thinks might still be in a kind of state of nature. He doesn't know much about Native Americans, but he thinks maybe they're the kind of people who are still in a state of nature. But for the most part, it's a thought experiment. He says, what would people be like if they didn't exist in society? What would people be like if we removed all of the social restrictions on them and they existed as individuals, separate from each other in an original state of nature? What if we were to take humanity back before society and imagine that humans are just solitary animals roaming around, trying to figure out what to do? What would these human beings be like? Now, of course, you can hear Aristotle groaning in the background, like, whoa, and rolling around in his grave. If there's probably not a body, it's gone a long time ago. But in any case, you can hear Aristotle like, what are you doing? Haven't I said this is the stupidest way to start political thought? Because everybody comes from a society, at least a family. Well, no, says Hobbes. That's not where we should begin our thinking. We should begin our thinking with the individual. This is a radical move, and it shapes everything that comes after it in political thought. Because before Hobbes, no one imagined that you could actually start political thinking this way. And after Hobbes, most people can't imagine thinking about politics any other way. So Hobbes starts with the individual in a kind of pure state of nature. Now, this doesn't mean that the individual can't have any interactions with other people, But it does mean that the individual is a kind of self-contained atom. They are not bound by contracts or mores or culture or social morality. They are their own people. And in many ways, this allows Thomas Hobbes to talk about how every individual is self-made. Now, what does it look like if we had individuals in a state of nature? Well, it's not going to be pretty, thinks Hobbes. Hobbes starts out in what we might think of as a kind of enlightened modern way. Being a member of the Enlightenment, who knew? He suggests that, in fact, human beings are born naturally equal to each other. Again, you can see that he's kind of trying to reject everything Aristotle thought. So he says human beings are born originally equal with each other, like these cute young pumpkins there. Except for in Hobbes's vision, equality doesn't end up being that cute. Because being born equal for Hobbes means that human beings are born with equal rights. Well, this sounds promising, like all human beings have equal rights, right? So like I've got a right to my life and you've got a right to your life. No, not exactly. All human beings are born with equal rights, says Hobbes, in the sense that they have a right to everything. So I don't just have a right to my life, you've got a right to my life as well. I have a right to this shirt and you have a right to this shirt. We all have a right to everything that exists. So imagine like I'm walking along and I see you one day and I'm like, hey, nice pants you got there. You know what? I think I want those pants. Here, doink! Those pants are mine now. They're a bit small. I don't think I can wear them. Okay, so everyone has a right to everything. There is no distinction between what belongs to me and what belongs to you. There is no private property because everyone has a right to everything that's around them. So everything belongs to me and everything belongs to you. And the only thing that's going to sort that out is a fight between us, trying to figure out who has the more power in order to establish who can gain control over the particular goods. This means that in the state of nature, there is functionally no morality. While he can talk about natural right, Hobbes cannot talk about natural morality. Now, we can think about this as we think about other animals in the state of nature, or at least other animals if we don't pull the scope too wide. So think about the lion and the antelope, or if this is an antelope, I don't know what it is. It's some kind of deer runny thingy. So imagine those two, right? So which one has a right to the antelope's life? Well, certainly the antelope has a right to its life. If it can keep itself going, good for it. Way to go, antelope, right? But is the right to its life only the antelope's? Well, if the lion can catch it, then the antelope pretty much becomes the property of the lion. We don't think that this is immoral. We don't look at the lion and we're like, you know what? You're stealing that antelope's life or his coat. You should have at least left him his coat. That doesn't make any sense. He's dead. But in any case, so for Hobbes, there is no such thing as natural morality. Again, more picking on Aristotle. I remember when I said the only thing that could sort it out between us was a kind of contest of power to see who could actually take control over the goods? Well, Hobbes has more to say about this too. Because he says, you know what, human beings are not only equal in their rights, they're also equal in their power. Now, what does he mean by this? Because I could totally take you in a fight, like any day. Just name it. In any case, he doesn't mean exactly that. Everybody has, say, the same amount of muscle and strength, or that everybody's equally smart with each other. He believes instead that people are fairly diverse in exactly which powers they have. So some people will be strong, some people will be smart, and there's a whole kind of mixture of these. Beyond this, it's also true that over your life you go through different periods in which you're kind of weak in one area and strong in another. Obviously, children and the elderly, they won't be as strong, but they might be able to have other things that can make up for that, like the cuteness of a child, or the elderliness of an elderly person. I don't know what would make up for that. In any case, what Hobbes means by claiming that people have equal power is basically that everyone has enough power that they could kill other people. So no one is impervious to being killed. Being finite creatures, all it takes is like covering our 3 air holes. That's it. And then we're dead. Now, I know you might be wondering, thinking like, okay, but what about people who have disabilities? And what about people who don't, in fact, have these capabilities? And I guess Hobbes' answer to them is, well, they would not do very well in the state of nature. So we don't really have to worry about them. It's kind of social Darwinian position, except for it's before Darwin, because Darwin actually picks up on this from Hobbes. But in any case, so everyone, says Hobbes, is born equal, with equal rights and equal power, which means we all own everything, meaning that there's just a battle of power over who can control different things, and we all have enough power to kill each other. Well, doesn't this sound like a fun recipe for society? Oh, one thing. So congratulations, women. You've actually gained equality for the first time in political philosophy. I mean, I guess there were the Stoics and maybe the Guardians in Plato's Republic. But in a modern kind of liberal sense, here you are, you're actually treated as equal to men. We're all equally bad. Or I guess there's no bad because there's no morality, but women also are included by Hobbes in the category of having equal rights and having equal power. Now, since then, feminists have made arguments about this, especially about the implications of Hobbes' view, because there is a tendency, right, not an absolute rule, but a tendency that women have less, say, muscle than men, and so it might be that women would actually get abused in Hobbes' system. But Hobbes doesn't really say anything about that, and as a matter of fact, Hobbes is such a strict-going individualist that he doesn't even really want to recognize the family as a natural institution. So he's got the problem, like, what do you do with human birth? Well, instead of treating children as if they're participants in an immediate society of the family, he says, no, children are really property of other individuals until they become individuals themselves. And whose property are they? Well, he says, so when a child is born, you know what we know about it? We know who the mother is. You don't necessarily know who the father is. I mean, assume in a state of nature, should be all sorts of things going on around there. So we don't really know who the father is. So the child is first the property of the mother. Now, if a father wants to have a role, have any kind of paternal role in their children's lives, have any rights over the property of the child, they actually have to get the mom to make an agreement with them at that point, to enter into a contract with the mother so that their parental rights will be recognized. And that's going to be the same thing that Hobbes eventually does with society, is enter into a kind of contract. Because contracts are the main ways for Hobbes that we actually establish any kind of relationship between our atomic selves in the world. Now, it's not clear that this is entirely a feminist idea, because it also is not clear that the male has any obligations to the child. But I guess it's not entirely clear that the mother has obligations to the child either, because the child is just her property. Hobbes' world is a weird, strange world, and it's interesting how much it actually ends up informing our own. Okay, let's add to this wonderful mix that we've got going on of everyone having rights to everything and everybody having the power to kill each other, that we're all selfish. So we're all egoists, according to Hobbes. This is not a normative claim. He's not saying that, we could have been better, but we decided to be egoists. He thinks that we are all egoists by nature. This is just the way we are. And in some ways, Hobbes wants to conclude this from an analysis of kind of the mechanics of the human being. Sometimes he treats human beings as kind of machines. What is life, he says, but motion? But the motion of the limbs, so I'm clearly alive right now. Or the motion of the blood around the body. And so what is it to keep life going but to keep yourself in motion? And this is really what we want to do. It's this motion inside of us that leads us to our kind of emotions and our passions. They're expressions of this moving machine that we are. But that moving machine is then immediately tied to itself and not to anything else. We can only follow those passions which we have and follow those out as far as we can go. Now, Hobbes is really fairly radical in this, and in some ways, we could even see the beginnings of existentialism, a later philosophy that's mostly in the 20th century, emerging from some of Hobbes's ideas. So, do I choose it because it's good, or is it good because I chose it? Now, the classical answer to this question is, well, there are good things out there, right? I mean, human beings have a particular nature, so that there are good activities, right? I mean, Aristotle's like eudaimonia. There's a set of activities and goods that are suited for human beings. And when human beings look out on those goods, they recognize them as good, and that's why they choose them, because they believe that they fit with human nature, and they draw humanity towards them. Well, Hobbes reverses this. Typical of his approach to Aristotle, he says, no, that's not really true. As a matter of fact, what comes first is not the goodness of the thing, but my will. I choose what I see as good. So when I get up in the morning, I look at, I mean, this would not happen in the state of nature because they don't have cereal, but I look at my Frosted Flakes and my Wheaties and my Fiber Bran and my Fruity Pebbles. And I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna decide what's good this morning. I'm gonna look over and decide my Fruity Pebbles, right? So, for Hobbes's point of view, human beings are really so atomistic that there is no real good outside in the world. We project that good upon the world. The world is a set of plain material objects. Many of those objects can serve as means for the things that I want. And I can choose amongst them, and whichever one I choose is just what's good for me. Hobbes also says there is no summum bonum. What does that mean? Well, it's Latin for there is no highest good. So Aristotle's picture of the fulfilled person who finds all of those appropriate activities and gains all of the appropriate virtues and has all of the appropriate goods, that person, Aristotle says, achieves the highest good, achieves eudaimonia. Just as Plato said, the person who in fact gains knowledge finds a kind of state of perfection that they're able to live in from now on. Well, Hobbes just says, nah, that just doesn't exist. As a matter of fact, felicity, says Hobbes, is a continual progress of the desire from one object to another, the attaining of the former being still but the way to the latter. So for Hobbes, human beings just, we will things, we like things. I mean, I like that thing, and so I want it, and so I do what I need to do in order to get that thing, right? But as soon as I get that thing, I'm like, oh, okay, I've got that thing, but really I need something else. Let's look around and see what else I could get, okay? And this is just a perpetual process. This just is what life is. Felicity or happiness only comes about through kind of going and getting the things that you want. But you're never done with this. You never attain a kind of final state of happiness. There's no point at which, you know what, I have everything that I need. In some ways, Hobbes's every human being is like Thrasymachus's unjust man to Plato. The person who is constantly driven to gather more and gather more. Hobbes says that's not injustice, that's just human nature. We're never going to be fulfilled. We're never going to be entirely happy. We just keep going and getting more stuff. Now, in this system, it's important to recognize that there's a fundamental shift that's happened that will break a lot of classical thinking. In this system, what people want is better than what's good for people. Or, put more accurately, there is nothing that is naturally good for people, so all we have to go on is what people want. This is a fundamental reversal of all of moral psychology from the classic thought. So you remember that for Plato, the ideal person had reason in charge of the appetites, because reason came to knowledge about the good, and then ordered the rest of the self on the basis of that knowledge. Aristotle had a kind of commerce between the reason and the appetites, but still the reason played the key role. The appetites had to be trained to be put into position so they could aid reason in the process of discerning the good. And Augustine had suggested that basically the classical picture was right, except that they'd missed the place that love of God had put into the system. So he fundamentally agreed that if you loved God, you would in fact have everything in the proper order, because loving God meant loving all the things that God loved in their proper order. Well, again, Hobbes comes along and says, nope, here's the deal. We are big bags of appetites. That's what we start as. We start as people who will and want particular things. And then reason is actually underneath the appetites. What reason does is to function as a servant of the appetites. So once I figure out what I want, I can deploy reason at that point to figure out how to get it. Reason doesn't give me access to the good. It's not like I have some natural law that I'm participating in God's thoughts and it's gaining me information about the good. There he's throwing Thomas Aquinas to the side. But instead, I'm just a kind of big ball of appetites. I figure out what I want, and then reason is the servant that figures out how to get it for me. This also blows apart most of classical thought about the common good. So, going back to Plato, you remember that justice itself was, in some sense, everybody fulfilling their role, everybody doing their job, because everybody had a particular thing that they were supposed to do, something they were good at, and something that fit with their nature. And so you could find a society where everybody would find their fulfillment in different activities. The producers were happy producing, the auxiliaries were happy auxiliating, and the guardians were happy gardening. That's not right at all. The guardians were, you remember Plato, I'm not going to go into it again. In any case, similar for Aristotle, who thought that there were in fact natural slaves even, and that being slaves was in fact better for them, because they were naturally out of control. Well, goodbye to that if we have to start with what people want. You remember that Plato said you couldn't start out with what people want, because people would be wrong about it all the time. If you allow the producers to think about what they want, they might think, well, you know what, I'd be a really good leader for society. But they aren't actually, because they don't have the knowledge to do that. Remember, you should want in leadership as somebody better than yourself, somebody smarter than yourself. But this isn't going to work according to Hobbes, because as a matter of fact, what people want is just whatever they want. There isn't any place else to go in order to figure out what's good. Now, things became a little bit more complicated under Augustine, and in some ways, as often happens, Augustine offers a kind of middle position here, because Augustine did recognize a society in which people had different ultimate aims. But Hobbes, well, for Hobbes, you've got to take that another step further, because Augustine imagined this as an argument between the city of God and the city of humanity. And so there were a group of people who were arguing about this, but there were true goods. There are even true finite goods that you could find in the overlap between them. In Hobbes' system, we have to imagine just a whole number of people, and everyone aiming at something different because they like that thing. Maybe you like Choco Pebbles and I like Fruity Pebbles, and somebody else likes that bran stuff. I mean, my God. But in any case, everybody likes different things. And now we've got to figure out, how do you put a society together if that's the case, right? Everybody's selfish, everybody's pursuing their own wants, everybody has equal power, and everybody has a right to everything. This is going to be lovely. Let's add to this another bit. So Hobbes says, yeah, there's a diversity of passions and everybody has different passions for different things, and you can choose all sorts of different things to like, and whether you like them or not, you can sleep on the floor, sleep on a bed. But there are two dominant passions that kind of override, and these are not primary passions for particular things. They're secondary passions, they're higher level passions, because they're passions that have to do with how we relate to other people and how we think about ourselves, no matter what goods we in fact particularly value. These are the passions of fear and pride, and they are in some ways inversions of one another. So our pride is our positive thought about ourselves and our wish to remain looking positive to everyone else. So in our moments when we are taken by the passion of pride, we think that we can in fact achieve great things. I've got the picture of Icarus here, the ancient Greek mythological figure who tried to fly too close to the sun, and his feathers fell off and he fell back to the ground. In any case, we're filled with pride. We want to look in comparison to everyone else like we're winning. So whatever the game of human life is, if it's to get the most stuff, if it's to get ahead, if it's to be the strongest, we want to present an appearance of ourselves that makes us look like that. And we want to be as close to that as possible. We would like to be gods. We would like not to have the same power as each other, but for ourselves to have superior power over everyone else. If you listen to it, everybody sounds kind of like those nobles from Machiavelli who were the greedy and ambitious ones. On the other side, perhaps there's the passion that would have been dominant for those peasants in Machiavelli, the passion of fear. So if pride makes us think that we're great, and perhaps greater than we are, fear is the passion that gets us to look around and wonder who could take this away from us. What is it possible for me to lose? Maybe I don't have as much power as I think. Maybe I ought to be more cautious than I am, because in fact, I'm not able to do all these things. I am not a god. Fear also has a social angle, because I don't want to look like I'm losing at the social race. I don't want to look like I'm the guy who's at the bottom of everybody else. Now for Hobbes, these two passions are the most dominant. So even over all of those other things that we choose, what we like and what we don't like, these two have some overriding control. Now, pride, probably being the strongest of the two, drives us towards diffidence. I don't know if you know what diffidence is. Diffidence is conflict. And really, if you didn't see this coming, I mean, from the guys, I had the guys earlier holding the rocks over their heads, and I said, this is not going well. So pride, the wish of every single one of us to be looking like, and in fact to be ahead in the race of life, leads us all, given that we all own everything and that we all have the same amount of power, to fight over everything. Because even if I have enough to, say, feed myself and provide for my survival, I keep looking at what other people are having and thinking, you know what, I want that too. And so over time, I'll tend to go and take things that other people have control over. Now, they have no moral claim against me in this, because I have a right to it as much as they do. But certainly, they also are filled with pride, and they want everything everybody else has. Now, this leads to what Hobbes thinks of the state of nature in general. He says the state of nature is a state of war of all against all. A complete anarchy, where people fight against each other for every scrap of goods that they can get a hold of. Life in the state of nature, says Hobbes, is solitary, poor, brutish, and short. There are none of the advantages of society. We have no developed arts or even developed language, no developed philosophy. There is just our base greed and pride driving us to fight with each other and even to the point of killing each other. Isn't this someplace you'd like to visit? Okay, so at this point, we're getting to the end of our discussion of the state of nature. So I'll take a break here, and I'll start off with the second section where we move back into society for Hobbes and try and figure out how we can escape this state of nature and get into something better, something where Charles II will be in charge. Charles in charge of my days and my life. You're too young to actually know this song, but it's Charles in charge. Okay, see you in a minute.